Thank you guys, first of all, a little bit of opening gratitude for our session here today. One, thank you all very much for coming throughout. I know some of you have had other commitments, other things sort of going on, but I really appreciate all the time and effort that you guys have spent making this part of your week for the last 6 weeks or so, 7 weeks, I guess, technically. So it's been really, really great being able to journey through all this with you. So first of all, thank you to you. Second of all, I would invite you all to give a look back that way and give a big thanks to our sound and tech team. Particularly those of you who are joining us online here tonight. Without these fine people, we would not be able to journey with you into your homes, whether you're watching this live or whether you're watching this after the fact. So big thanks to our digital ministry team here at the parish for all that they've done for us in this specific event, and of course, sort of throughout all of our parish ministries, all the ways in which they help support us. Yeah, we're going to jump into things. One last little bit of housekeeping. There's no non-blunt way of saying this. I don't know that we're going to get time for a break tonight. I was putting this together and I was like, oh my gosh, this is I'm going to go on for forever, and it's all I'm going to be able to do to keep on track. So if you do at any point during our time tonight need to go to the bathroom, get a drink, need a glass of water or something, just need to stretch your legs, please feel free to just get up and go. I will not be offended. You will not be rude or considered ill-mannered or anything like that. Yeah, I wanted to flag that at the start, is I don't think there's going to be room for an official break window here as we cover stuff. But as always, do feel free to ask questions or ask anything that is important to you over the course of this, whether from the reading or from what we're talking about here today. That's what we're here to do, is to help understand this more deeply. So we're going to go ahead and get started with our prayer as we usually do, whether you're following on screen or following on the prayer cards. Please join me as we pray through the intercession of Pope St. Leo the Great one last time. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. O God, who never allow the gates of hell to prevail against your church, which is firmly founded on the apostolic rock, grant us, we pray, through the intercession of Pope St. Leo the Great, that we, your faithful, may stand firm in your truth and know the protection of your lasting peace. We ask this through our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. So once again, welcome one last time as we continue our session here on the Lions of the Church, finishing it up here today with Leo's 12, 13, and 14. One last time, especially for those joining us online, my name is Alex Craven. I'm the Faith Formation Coordinator here at Holy Trinity Parish. If you are interested in any of the stuff, I'll reference like materials and readings and stuff like that throughout the course of our evening together. If you want in on that, send me an email. My contact info should be on your screen, and I'd be more than happy to help you out and get you connected, even after the fact, because obviously this is our final session this evening. Little bit of refresher. Again, I know some of you have sort of been in and out for weather-related reasons and other sort of things here, or if you're catching up online. The Pope has a number of different titles which are emblematic of the role in which he plays in the whole church overall. The first and foremost title is that of the Bishop of Rome. As I've said before, you become the Pope by becoming the Bishop of Rome. That is the core the core element of the job. But the Pope is also considered the vicar of Jesus Christ, right? The Christ's representative to us on earth. He is the successor of the Prince of the Apostles, sitting in that place that St. Peter chaired initially, and then successive popes down the line have chaired from there, and carrying over that office that Christ gave to Peter, right, handing the keys over to him. And then is the supreme pontiff of the universal church, that go-between that takes our prayers to God and helps receive from God all of those things that the church uses to strengthen her people sort of throughout. So that sort of supreme go-between in that particular capacity. However, there is one office that was on the slide the first week that we haven't really come back to. We've sort of talked in different ways about some of the other ones, like sovereign of this state, and we talked about the papal states and some of those other roles, the patriarch of the West, right? We talked about those 5 C's and how the Pope is sort of the only one in the western half of the Christian world. But the one that we're going to be focusing on to a certain extent today is this one, which is arguably one of the most important ones. If I'm remembering correctly, this was a title that the popes claimed from about the time of St. Gregory the Great, one of the greats of the papacy, which is around 700-ish sort of time frame, so a little bit after, within the time frame that we're talking about, but just wasn't one of our stops on our way. But this is the title of the servant of the servants of God, which many more recent popes, I think Pope Francis in particular, had a particular fondness for this office of the papacy, for this role of the papacy, that he is the foremost servant of all the Christian faithful, all the disciples of Christ, that he is their foremost servant in a very sort of Christ washing the feet of the disciples kind of way, that the Pope is someone who is there to help serve the faithful and help them on this route ultimately toward heaven, but following the gospel in our daily lives, sort of on this side of eternity. And we'll see that in particularly with one of our popes that we're going to be speaking about here today, particularly Leo XIII, who we'll get to eventually. But I wanted to really flag this one because this role, I think, takes on a new significance in the time period that we're going to talk about, and you might understand that more once I get to sort of the thesis of the day. But we talked about these papal principles, right? The guide, guard, and governance, that the Pope is there to guide the faithful in sort of right doctrine versus wrong doctrine, right? We saw that especially with Pope Leo I. The idea of guarding that deposit of faith, of keeping the faithful safe from errors, keeping the church safe from threats internal and external, and then the governance of the church, sort of the buck stops here sort of thing of making sure that all the wheels are kept in the wagon, that bishops and priests and various other ministers are sort of doing the jobs that they need to be doing. So these three core principles of guiding, guarding, and governing the church throughout the world. We talked in our second session, right? Those are our first session principles. The second session, we talked about Leo the Great himself. We dedicated a whole session to one guy. And in the course of going through his life, we talked about how he sort of brings that model of papacy, the guide, guard, and governing model of papacy, together in the way in which he exercised his office and his authority. We talked about in our third session how after the Roman Empire sort of falls apart in the western half of Europe, the papacy is sort of the office that steps into that role and tried to provide some safety and security in that time. This is sort of the time of Leo III and Charlemagne, if you remember those names from earlier, trying to provide some stability in the power vacuum that happened afterwards, right? We talked about how Italy turned into the Thunderdome for a little bit, and it was a bit of a mess. And then a little bit later on, we talked about the low point of the papacy in the 900s, where the papacy's scope sort of narrowed to such an extent that they weren't really able to exercise the fullness of their office effectively. And there was sort of a failure on the part of the papacy to guide, guard, and govern effectively. But as we talked about as well, I think it might be more accurate to say that there wasn't that ability wasn't facilitated, but you could see in some of the popes that there was still the desire and the effort to do so, even though the scope of what they could, how far they could reach was relatively restricted. And then our last session on the schismatic popes of Leo IX, 10, and 11, we talked about how a lot of the consequences of the medieval church and the church of Leo I on really started to catch up to the papacy as an institution, how those past decisions and some of those past fault lines eventually, there was a system shock into them through the excommunication in 1054 of the papal legates and the Eastern Orthodox, what we now call Eastern Orthodox, Patriarch of Constantinople. There was that, and then obviously we talked about the Protestant Reformation with Leo X and Martin Luther, and all of these different fault lines that had appeared in the church, and the way in which the papacy sort of responded to, or in some cases struggled to respond effectively to these schisms that eventually ended up happening over the course of church history. So that is where we left off last week. Was with this element. We talked very briefly about Leo the 11th, who didn't outlive the month he was elected, and sort of how the world was much different by the time of Leo the 11th versus Leo the 9th, where we started our evening. So, running up to this, we're basically in the year 1605, which is when Leo the 11th was, and going forward from here, basically 1605 to today, the papacy goes through a number of different changes because the temporal power balance in Europe and sort of in the world in general, and Christendom in particular, means that the papacy ends up losing a great deal of its temporal power, by which I mean power of like governance or power that we would think of in terms of, the things a government could do or the things that a state could do. It loses a lot of that, but it picks up a great deal more sort of spiritual or moral authority or moral power, which it then uses to continue trying to minister to the faithful in the guide, guard, govern sort of model, and grapples with the questions of the age. And as you'll see throughout today, this world that we're going to talk about in this last session is wildly different than any other sort of world or circumstance that we've talked about in leading up to this, right? There is a certain, like if you're a historian or papal historian, don't at me on the internet, but the world leading up to 1605 has, I think, a lot more in common with itself. The Christian world leading up to 1605 has a lot more internally in common than the world that we're going to be talking about going forward today. Is a bold claim that I'm going to make on the internet. So we're talking again, Leo 10, 11, and 12, and you'll notice there that Pope Leo the 12th, which is the next one in sort of our queue here, is in the year 1800. So we're going to have to do a little bit of a time jump to catch up to him, but I want to fill you in on some of the important steps that happen in between sort of 1605 and in the 1820s before we get up to Leo the 10th and then Leo the 11th in the back half of the 19th century, and then, of course, our current Leo, who is at the, I guess we're still at the beginning of the 21st century. We haven't quite hit the halfway mark. So a lot of different things going on here. So this map that I'm throwing up on the screen here, I believe is also in your packets, but I might be misremembering. I know I did sneak a couple extra maps in there before I gave them to you guys. This map that you can see on screen, or might be in your packets there, is a map of a really significant event that happens in the 17th century, which is known as the 30 Years' War. If you want to guess, take a guess why, your first answer is probably going to be correct, because it lasted about 30 years. But it had a number of different phases of it and elements of it sort of throughout. The important part of this map, though, is not necessarily what, like, you can see like different elements here on the screen of like, these lands belong to this group and these lands belong to that group, and here's a border here and here's a country here, here's a alliance group here. What ends up happening in this war is a number of really important things. This war takes place in the mid-1600s and starts off as a religious conflict within the Holy Roman Empire, which is, if you remember, that what Leo III crowns Charlemagne and crowns him as Holy Roman Empire. This is, the same polity 800 years on, so it doesn't quite look the same, but we're still dealing with the same organization, the same institution. And within the Holy Roman Empire, there is a conflict between Catholic and Protestant princes that eventually boil over. The Holy Roman Empire worked in a really weird way that we don't really think of like empires working. A lot of times you think of the empire and you think of like the Romans, or you might think of like the empire from like Star Wars or whatever, where there's like one emperor at the top who's sort of in control, direct control of everything, and has nefarious powers to exert that will in a different way. The Holy Roman Empire was a shambles. The emperor was elected by a number of princes of the empire. There were, I'm not going to give you a good number here because I don't know if there is one. There were dozens of different princes of the empire that had different levels of authority. Some were bishops, some were counts, some were dukes, some were leaders of free cities. In different ways that would all meet in this thing called the Imperial Diet, which was kind of like a parliament, but not really. And for the lack of a better term, the emperor only had authority if people decided to give it to him, right? The emperor couldn't just like waltz up and be like, I am in charge, and the dukes would be like, are you? Are you really in charge? And so that creates a lot of like friction here, and ultimately what ends up happening is in the eastern part of the empire, there's a dispute between Catholics and Protestants that boils over into armed conflict among Protestant leaders in the Holy Roman Empire. Like, so this would be like heads of Protestant principalities within it, Protestant dukes, Protestant counts, and so on. Form a league. The Catholic elements of the empire also form a league led by the Holy Roman Emperor from the family of the von Habsburgs, if you've heard of them before in various historical contexts. There's a lot of conflict and fighting at different points. The Swedish get involved at one point. The Spanish and the Dutch roll a war into it. The various German principalities are all slapping each other at different points. The French actually join on the side of the Protestants because they hate the Habsburgs that much. So they're fighting as a Catholic nation against the Catholic side of the war because they don't like the people in charge of that side. This whole thing is a rollicking political mess. It is a very fun time to learn about and not a fun time to live through. But eventually what ends up happening as a result of this is within the empire there is a freedom of religion that is sort of loosely established, by which I mean whatever religion the duke or the count or the archbishop or the king or the emperor, whoever you're under, lives with, then that is the faith of that part of the empire, right? And so if you're Protestant, you're living in a Catholic area, get out. Like go to a Protestant part. If you're in a Catholic living in a Protestant part, same thing the other way, right? There's a lot of movement here, but there is a sort of religious peace that is established by the end of it. By the way, the stupid part of this whole thing is the religious peace that was established by 30 years of people stabbing each other to death was the same policy that was in place when the war started. We spent 30 years to accomplish nothing. So it's not a great mark on the history of our church in general. But one of the things that this does is, two things that this does. One, in doing this, in sort of the Holy Roman Emperor recognizing the authority of Protestant princes and the freedom of Protestant princes within the realm of Europe, in a certain sense, the reach of the papacy is dented a bit, right? Because if you're not Catholic, if the whole thing is that you're Protestant, that you're in protest against Rome and the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope can say whatever he wants and you're not going to do it, especially in this time period after, there's been a great deal of armed conflict sort of surrounding those issues, at least at the start. So that's a sort of a dent to the papacy's ability to kind of, so to speak, do its job, okay? The other thing that this kicks us into is an era of European history known as the era or the age of absolutism. If you remember your maybe high school history books or whatnot, over on the left-hand side there is King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, the king who built the Palace of Versailles. Extended French influence throughout Europe made France the most prominent European nation of its day. And on the right-hand side there, you have a portrait of Cardinal Richelieu, who you also might have heard of, which was the king's sort of right-hand minister, King Louis XIV's right-hand minister, which worked to assert the power of these deeply important and entrenched, Louis XIV fundamentally acting as an emperor, even though he doesn't technically have an empire. The French now have overseas colonies. Quebec is being established in our corner of the world. The power of the French military of the time was unrivaled across Europe. The power that monarchies had in this time was a novelty that cannot really be overstated. It's not like the king could necessarily enact everything that he wanted, but had a level of authority and power and centralization that was very different from the society that came before this, where it was the king was a leader of all of the nobility, and the nobility kept the people under them in line, they kept those people under them in line. It was this tiered system, and the idea with absolutism is it's the king, and that he's the one in charge fundamentally, right, of everybody all the way down the chain. It's not the daisy chain sort of model. These two things are really, really important because without these two things, we don't, we eventually come into a period, sorry, with these two things, we eventually come into a period known as the Enlightenment, which is a very important period of history, spanning, again, into like the 17th and 18th centuries. You have a lot of different philosophers, some of whom you see up here, some of whom you might recognize. Ben Franklin up there on the top left, David Hume in the middle there, a famous Scottish philosopher, Jacques Diderot, Edmund Burke, I think it's Johann von Goethe, Immanuel Kant, Thomas Jefferson, Voltaire, all of these guys pushing like sort of a philosophical envelope during the time of the Enlightenment, because the fundamental way in which humanity started to look at the world was one based on, and this is sort of in the wake of the 30 Years' War, all of the horrors that were lived out through that, based on what you believed in religiously and on sort of a level that we would consider like metaphysics, which is the experience of life outside of the physical world. Meta means above, and physics means like physics, like if I did something like the physical, right? And so you have these guys, these kind of philosophers coming in and really interrogating those ideas in the light of what can we know through reason, empiricism, scientific method, testing alone. How would a society based on those principles organize itself, right? And coming out of this, there are a number of different directions coming out of it. Voltaire down there in the bottom right, deeply skeptical of religious ideas in general, and skeptical probably isn't quite the right word. Hostile to is probably a more accurate characterization. Thought a lot of like religious ideas were a bunch of bunk. And then on the other hand, you've got Immanuel Kant, who's two over from him, who writes lengthy treatises on how we can develop faith, like how reason can actually inform and support faith in different ways, why being a faith-filled person is a rational thing, not an irrational thing. Not arguing for any particular faith. He's not arguing for like Catholicism versus Lutheranism versus something else. He's arguing that the idea of faith itself is not, an irrational idea, that there are material things that we can use to point us to this, that we don't, necessarily have to engage in these complex metaphysics if you want to argue for faith, that there is rationality that can be brought to bear on this. Some of these other thinkers, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, you might be aware of, famous in sort of their role in the American Revolution, and the founding principles of that, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness kind of thing. David Hume and Edmund Burke involved in the generation of like the conservative movement in England, these policies of how do we do economic stuff in this time? How do we understand, like this is sort of like the genesis of the social science of economics. All of these things kind of get up off the ground. Adam Smith should be on this, but he's not for some reason. Also in that bandwagon, also in that boat of like sort of supply, demand. How can we understand what markets are doing? It is a reimagination of the world and of society based on these principles of, I've watched this thing, I've discovered this element of it, and I'm going to use the things I've observed to prove this hypothesis I have, or to disprove some hypothesis I've had. But again, a different way of looking at the world on, again, like a societal level, right? These things are being applied across the way in which human society organizes itself, not in sort of isolated incidents or isolated individuals. All of these things sort of come together. So the Enlightenment is, in many ways, a response to both the Renaissance that we talked about last time and the age of absolutism that I mentioned 20 seconds ago here. Both of these things lead us into the French Revolution, which is a time that, again, you might have remembered learning something about in high school history class or something like that. a deeply troubled time for the nation of France in a lot of different ways. You might be aware that they execute their king of the time, King Louis XVI, and his wife Marie Antoinette, who was an Austrian princess, member of the Austrian nobility. I will throw this little historical tidbit out there based on my personal heritage. Part of the reason why King Louis got killed was because he fundamentally bankrupts France supporting the American Revolution, because the French and the British hate each other that much. Bankrupts France, so without Louis XVI, we wouldn't have an America, probably. But he invests all this money because, again, we're operating on that absolutist model that the authority and the role of the king is to do the thing that advances the nation, and these Enlightenment ideas sort of come in and say, well, but why are you the king? Because God said so? That doesn't, prove it. Like, these sort of questions start arising on the nature of power and how society organizes itself, and what can you base what you're saying on? What is the foundation for that? And in a certain sense, it boils over in France based on a number of different factors that we don't really have time to get into. The thing that I need to highlight for our purposes here right now is that the church, in a lot of ways in France, was seen as part and parcel with the regime of the monarchy. That the church was a fundamental supporter of the king, was a fundamental supporter of the monarchical, the absolutist order of the church. And if I flip back here, right, the king's right-hand minister is a cardinal, right? Like, again, this is a different king than King Louis XVI. This is 14, who's about 100-ish years earlier, 150 years earlier. But the idea that the church and the monarchy were sort of this close together was an idea that sat very poorly with a lot of the French peasantry. And so in going after these remnants of the monarchy and these remnants of this feudal monarchical structure as France evolves itself into a republic in this time, the church gets hit really hard in this time period. And so that you get this picture on the right-hand side, this sort of political cartoon of this, you've got this very fat friar, priest, bishop individual, and you see they've got some sort of squish him out behavior, device that they're going to put him in to wring out the money or wring out the land or wring out the whatever from this church that has gotten, this French church that has gotten too fat because of its alliance with the monarchy, which was a principle that the Republican elements of France, the radical Republican elements of France, in the French Revolution really pushed for, of a de-religiousing of the French state in general. A lot of French clergy were forced to basically take an oath of allegiance to the country over the church. What I believe was called the civil constitutions. Civil constitutions on the clergy, which was this sort of oath that the French clergy would be required to take if they wanted to continue doing clerical work, that you are employees of the state now and not of the church. You can do whatever bunk you want, but this is, you work for us now, kind of thing. As you might imagine, the Pope of the time, Pope Pius VI, didn't really take kindly to this element of the revolution. And fundamentally, he is captured by a little-known person to history. You probably have no idea who this is. Napoleon Bonaparte, just some guy who did nothing with his life. But Napoleon Bonaparte, not yet the guy that we know him as historically, but just I believe at the time he was a colonel in the French army, goes down to Rome, seizes the Papal States as part of the revolutionary expansion of France in this time period, and fundamentally takes Pope Pius VI as a prisoner back to France, where he dies actually within a stone's throw of Avignon and the papal palaces that his predecessors had built in a small town in the south of France as an exile. His next in line is Pius VII, who, though not a Leo, is sort of important for our story here, because Pius VII is most of Pius VII's papacy is tied up with Napoleon as Napoleon, right? Not as a just a French military officer, but as Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, and one of the greatest tactical generals that has ever fired a cannon at somebody. Napoleon does a lot of different things in this time period. There's a lot of tug and back and forth between Napoleon and the church in this time. There is also a lot of back and forth between Napoleon and Pius VII, Pius VI's successor, in this sort of window as well. Pius VII actually tried to take a relatively sort of conciliatory approach to the French in this time, looking at it, and there's a particular homily that he gives when he was, I believe, like Archbishop of somewhere in northern Italy, where he gives this speech and basically says to the people of the time who were then under like French occupation, Italians under French occupation, saying, listen, they have these ideas of like republicanism and democracy. These things are not out of step with the gospel. You can be a good Christian and a good Democrat, lowercase d, we're not talking about the US political party. You can be a good Christian and a good Democrat at the same time. And this idea, and he tries in a very strong way to create some reconciliation between the French as a nation, as Napoleon sort of like allows the church to sort of regrow at the time, and also the rights and the privileges of the church, and along with the best interest of the French people in this very, again, tumultuous time once again. However, eventually Pius VII is brought in by Napoleon to crown him as Emperor of the French. Very much a la Leo III crowning Charlemagne, this very sort of big ceremony going on. That's what's going on in the picture there in the left. You see not Charlemagne, Napoleon there in the center. He is about to crown his wife, the Empress Josephine, who's the woman kneeling there in front of him. And then if you look just behind Napoleon there, seated down on the chair is Pius, looking very small in this picture, which is sort of by design of the artist, that the person who is the important element of this picture is Napoleon, right? Not the Pope. And this is sort of the world Napoleon saw. However, Napoleon and Pope Pius continue to get into a number of frictive elements, and Napoleon invades the Papal States, invades France again, takes Pius as I guess technically not prisoner, just arrests him. It's the same thing. And you see in the picture there on the right, Pius is taken away into exile in France for a time. However, you might know the ending story of Napoleon, that he gets beat by one of the many coalitions in Europe that his expansionist policies trigger, and Pius is allowed to return back to Rome, saying of Napoleon, even throughout all of this, that I still think of him as a son, even though a somewhat stubborn son, right? That this is kind of this element of Pius not trying to like draw a line in the sand or create spiritual or political friction necessarily with Napoleon, trying to work with this this remnants of the French Revolution turning into an empire, but Napoleon's ego is Napoleon's ego, and it will not let him do anything apart from make himself the biggest and most special boy. And so he ends up coming into friction with Pius, but Pius is restored into Rome itself with the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo, and the Papal States are restored back to the Pope by the powers, European powers, sort of redrawing the borders back to pre-Napoleon borders and times, right? So this isn't French anymore, this is German now, this is Italian, this belongs to you, and this sort of redrawing of the borders here. The reason why all of this is important is because the manner in which the church was treated in the French Revolution sort of era, and under Napoleon as well, which we kind of can sort of not quite roll together, but they are correlated events, gives us the papacy of Leo XII, because the church had taken in a certain sense, felt that it had been treated so badly by these new ideas, these ideas which espouse rationalism and Enlightenment policies, and the idea of all people of a particular group being part of one nation. A lot of these ideas that Napoleon and his empire spread, all of these ideas had just black-eyed the church, to no end. That they'd taken our land, they'd forced our clergy into these particular policies, they'd done XYZ things to us, and that they are, like, the Pope that tried to work with them was taken prisoner by them. So there were many in the church at this time that felt that these ideas, which I think for us are fairly like milquetoast today, not the idea of like abusing the church, but the idea of like democracy in general. I think I would assume that most people in this room living in, Canada are pretty much like, democracy is an okay thing. That those policies at this time were seen as dangerous and threatening to the safety and stability of the church. And so there is this movement within the College of Cardinals and the bishops and the elite of the church, what is known as reactionaryism, or being a reactionary, which means that fundamentally you are acting in reaction to push back against ideas that are considered too radical, too revolutionary, going too far, okay? And trying to restore an older form of life, governance, whatever. And Leo the XII is elected by this sort of reactionary element of the church in response to how Pius VI and VII were treated, how the church in France was treated, how those ideas as they spread across Europe created further discord and strife for clerical authorities across Europe. And in all that sort of era of, if this is the idea, like basically the church thinking at the time, or the leadership of the church thinking at the time, if this is what democracy means, we don't want any part of it, and it needs to be stopped at all costs, because all it does apparently is make everyone go crazy and hurt each other. And I'm not trying to like stand up for that belief. I don't particularly think that not democracy is a good idea, but this is sort of like, I think, coming out of what the church had gone through in the preceding 50 years or so, I'm not surprised by this response. But so Leo XII is elected by this very conservative wing of the church. I don't usually like using political terms with respect to the church, but he's elected by a group that is looking to push back on this and sort of restore some of that feudal, absolutist, those sort of like structures to society. So if you remember, the Pope in this time is functionally doing two jobs. He's the supreme pontiff, he's the supreme pastor of the universal church. He's also the king of a country, right? He's got the Papal States, which is a good chunk of northern Italy. Leo, as the monarch of the Papal States, is, I'm just going to be honest, it's not good. He does not do good things, fundamentally. I've got a fun list here. As monarch of the Papal States, he works to reassert that sort of absolutist, feudal sort of structure of things. He promotes clergy into many government offices and roles. In the wake of Napoleon, a lot of different reforms had taken place within northern Italy, because that was the territory the French had sort of directly grabbed onto and occupied, and brought a lot of these republican ideas to northern Italy. And like, for instance, like, government should be done in the language that people can understand, which for them would be like Italian, like northern Italian. And Leo, when he comes back in, is like, nope, everything's back to Latin. We're doing everything in Latin, schools in Latin, courts are in Latin. This is the language of tradition, this is the language of the church, this is the language of the office of the papacy, this is how official business will be conducted. Figure it out, right? So not necessarily a great move there. He also had, how do I say this? Leo did an anti-Semitism by forcing Jews living in Rome into ghettos, which be like, these particular neighborhoods within the city, and also restricting them from owning functionally like property. Like, we're not saying he's like taking away their toothbrushes, but he like the incapacity to own like land property, real estate, business ventures, that sort of thing. The possibility of Jewish people living in Rome was greatly restricted under Leo's papacy, which again, not a good look, Leo, not a good move. Some other sort of things are a lot of the repudiation of Enlightenment ideas or those who would harbor their sympathies. He creates this is not the right term, so grain of salt this, but fundamentally like a commission to look for liberal ideas, which in this time period means just like democracy or the idea that the Pope shouldn't be in charge of the Papal States. Those sort of ideas, this group called like the Carbonari. He also distributed material and promulgations against what were considered like secret societies. So part of the Catholic Church's one of the initial phases of the Catholic Church and the Freemasons not getting along happens with Leo the XII. And so he takes this very like heavy-handed approach to his people, to the point where like he risked a lot of revolts. Like, people were mad at him in sort of across the Papal States, and so he had to sort of suppress rebellions. And in the 1800s, suppressing rebellions means using military force against your people. So as a monarch, Leo I would say maybe isn't one of the shining stars of the church. However, as the bishop and pastor of the Universal Church, Leo does I would argue, a much better job. He is much more suited to this role than the former role. For instance, he at home, which is to say in Italy and Europe and that sort of part of the world, does a great deal of diplomacy on the behalf of the rights of Christians in various parts of the world, and he works to disentangle one of those elements that I had talked about with the French Revolution, where local clergy were expected to have more of an allegiance to their nation state, or to, at best, sort of like local clergy. So like Father Tim would owe allegiance to Archbishop Dunn more than he would owe allegiance to anything the Pope said. Leo the 12th tries to undo that sort of line of thinking. It's a heresy that the church refers to as Gallicanism, which is fundamentally like, I won't say like local rule, but that that priests aren't responsible to Rome for their conduct and the office that they have been given, right? And so he pushes back against that. He does a great deal to try to aid local bishops in their endeavors, especially in those places where the wake of the French Revolution, Napoleon had significantly damaged the church. So he does a great deal of sort of like what I guess would call like almost like new evangelization. Like, we need to evangelize the people in the pews like before we get to evangelizing outside of that, because for like a generation or two, people weren't, so to speak, growing up Catholic anymore, especially in France in the wake of the Revolution. So Leo works to support local clergy in those regards, and also in parts of Germany and Spain where that was sort of also an issue, Italy as well. And he also really emphasizes foreign missionaries as well, particularly supporting missionaries in what we would consider like Southeast Asia. So that would be like Korea, South China, Vietnam, places that were primarily colonized by the French, and supporting their missionary endeavors in those places. So as a pastor, I think Leo does a much better job of guide, guard, and govern. As the leader of a what we might call like a government or a political entity, not doing a great job, Chief. And it's I highlight this because it does sort of differentiate these roles that the popes were doing, and how these two roles in the wake of the Enlightenment had sort of separated. That there is a different talk about how historians write about popes in this era, because you have this idea of that the church and the civil government aren't necessarily one and the same. Whereas for earlier popes, like for instance, the popes in the Dark Age of the church, right, the ones we talked about with 5, 6, 7, and 8, that the church and the civil government were kind of the same thing in a lot of places. Whereas in this time period, there is a way to sort of, you can like wedge them apart a little bit in how Leo conducts himself in what we would consider now one sphere versus another sphere. So it's a change in how things are thought of in this time, and Leo is a great sort of a example of how we can sort of see the papacy evolving in this time. But I think one of the things that Leo XII fundamentally doesn't do is, I don't mean like get with the times, but he doesn't necessarily understand that the time of sort of feudal absolute rule isn't there anymore, right? The reactionary sort of pushback to try to go back to this imagined before better time is going back to something that doesn't, that the world around him won't really sustain anymore. Yeah, Stephen, you had a question. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. I wouldn't quite go that far. For the benefit of the live stream, what Stephen has said is that you can see also. Correct me if I'm wrong. Like, jump in. But fundamentally, that you also see some of Leo's absolutism in his pastoral ministry, as well, of kind of how he handled things. And I think like I can appreciate where that is, but I think part and parcel with that is that, like I just said, like there's a wedging apart in how historians write about him, of like Leo the pastor versus Leo the monarch. But in Leo's mind, again, with those like sort of feudal, monarchical, absolutist tendencies, to him there isn't that distinction. And so like it is my job as pope and monarch of this territory to ensure proper moral authority or moral development of my subjects, as much as it is to ensure that there aren't brigands on the road, and that these other things do and don't happen. And so yeah, that's a really good point. That like I can see what you're saying, that there is some sort of absolutist or sort of heavy-handedness in the exercise of the pastoral authority as well. But I think like the way in which that is used does seem to be a bit lighter, especially like bizarrely Leo gets credited, I guess not bizarrely, but like in conflict with how you might think of him as I've presented him here, Leo is apparently either a very good diplomat himself or employs a number of very good diplomats sort of around him, that made a lot of inroads, as I said, with supporting church activity in places where it might have otherwise been treated somewhat hostilely, especially in the wake of, again, the revolution, sort of various revolutions, dismantling church power structures in their territory. That Leo, I think, recognizes outside of the papal states how much authority he does or doesn't have, but within the papal states, he's the absolute monarch, right? So I think that's sort of where the fine line kind of ends up being, where what he can and can't do within his borders is a lot different than what he can and can't do, or effectively do rather, outside the borders, if that makes sense. But I appreciate the comment and the insight. Leo the 12th, relatively short papacy. I believe I mentioned him before. He was elected by the cardinals and tried to turn it down because he was a rather infirm individual. His papacy lasts only 6 years, but he was kind of seen as a I hate to use this expression, but like kind of as like a palate cleanser pope after 2 very long reigns of 20 plus years, that we kind of need someone to sort of like sit there for 10 minutes so that people kind of like get a little bit of distance from the last few guys, and then we can sort of chart a new course. Like that was the college's thought process in electing him, of we need someone who's not going to be there for super long, okay? I want to sort of backtrack a little bit because we're like Leo the 12th leads us into getting into like the mid part of the 19th century, of the 1800s, and the 19th century I think can be characterized by my title up here of Everything Everywhere All at Once. The degree to which the world changed in the 19th century, I think you would truly struggle to overstate how much the world at the start of the 1800s was different than the world as the 1900s came on. And I want to highlight a couple of important things here because this will be important both perhaps in retrospect for Leo X, or Leo, I keep saying Leo X, sorry, Leo the 12th, and in foresight for Leo the 13th, who will be sort of one of our capstones for this evening. One of the things that is particularly important that I have up here is the advances in industry and technology, the mechanical and physical capacity of the world to make and do stuff goes off the charts in comparison to, again, the previous centuries and millennia. Up here on the screen, you kind of see under the text I put there a train, a telegraph, the idea that we can communicate effectively across long distances, across things that would take, if you just gave a note to a dude on a horse, might take days or weeks to get there, can travel in the span of minutes or hours, is a fundamental reshaping of how the world has the capacity to work. Also, the idea that things grown and produced in one place can move quickly and effectively to another. There's a television program my wife and I like to watch. We call it the Farm series. It's got a bunch of like archaeologists, and they live as farmers in some time period. So they have one where they live in the Victorian era, they have one where they live in the Tudor period, or they have one where they live as like farmers during World War II, and they're all in Britain. There's like a British program. And in the one in the Victorian era and the Edwardian era, which is sort of one after the other, one of the archaeologists talks about like the fact that like this would have been a novelty. The fact that you could get like fresh strawberries from an entirely different part of the country delivered to your town in the morning is like a true novelty, a true thing that like rewrote how the world interacted with itself. So we have great advances in industry and technology in terms of like communication, in terms of mechanical output. You've got like steam engines coming along here, all this different kinds of stuff that made the capacity of what human beings could produce like greater by orders of magnitude. One of the other elements of this era, particularly coming out of Europe and going into other parts of the world, many times unwantedly, is the idea of imperialism and colonization. That European powers, Britain, France, Spain, the Netherlands, Belgium, Russia, although kind of in a different way, these great powers of Europe were creating empires and colonies across the world. There's a period in the middle of the 19th century, or the 19th century, called the Scramble for Africa, where all these different colonial powers divided up Africa amongst themselves in order to extract resources and to create opportunities for like trade links and to facilitate movement of empire, or of armies and fleets and all these other tools of empire throughout this. This is when Britain like takes control of from the East Empire, or from the East India Company, takes control of India as a formal possession of the British Empire. Also, France has, as I mentioned, a great deal of interest in South Asia and East Asia. The Dutch have colonies across Africa, and also a great deal of colonies in what is now like the Caribbean and what we call Indonesia today. All these different kinds of things are this like massive expansion, this growing out from Europe of this pull in toward the center of these empires of goods and resources coming in. Britain fights a whole war with China just so they can sell them drugs because they can't pay enough money to get all the tea that they want. Like there's like truly wild stuff going on in this time period, boosted by this idea of we should go out and as Europeans, like, teach them how to Europe because that's the best way to live. Again, not saying that's right, saying that's what they were thinking. The last thing I also need to mention here is this idea of nationalism, which I touched on a little bit with Napoleon and the French, talking about the revolution. But in this particular era, there is the idea that people of a certain group, and a lot of times these were divided along like cultural lines or linguistic lines or things of that nature, should belong to a single nation, that all of the different Italian people should be part of one Italian nation, not these disparate little kingdoms and papal fiefdoms and this kingdom over here and this duchy over here and that sort of thing. The German people feeling very much the same. There are many people in what we would call the Balkans, again, sort of like Yugoslavia territory, Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, those sort of parts of the world that were all under the control of the Austrians, were agitating for like their own states in this time period. American and Canadian nationalism very much in this. Canada forms as a country in the 19th century, as I'm sure we all know, and the idea that like we are all one people, even if there might be great distances or difference between us, that we're all part of the same nation. And this idea comes out of this time period as well and is a massive mover and shaker in combination with all these other things, because in 1848, there are across Europe riots and revolutions. It's known as the Springtime of the Peoples, also called the Revolutions of 1848, where these different countries, I don't know if you see like the different flags across there of different states across Europe. You got like France and Germany and Italy and Belgium and some other ones a little bit more further back there, Ukrainian, Ruthenians, all these different groups agitating for not just a national rule, but many of them advocating for, again, like some sort of representative government of some kind. Not necessarily fully kicking out the idea of kings, but being like, hey, we should probably like have some say in how the world works around us instead of just like digging this dirt for, until I die. Like I would like at least some say in how the world around me runs. I would like some security for my family in terms of like economics and warfare and what's going on out there. These revolutions have a lot of different factors, these being among them, these things that we talked about here. But this era creates a great deal of instability in the middle of the 19th century and a great deal of, again, another sort of like wave of reactionaryism from the powers that be, various monarchs and states in charge at this point. Also during this time period, again, this is everything everywhere all at once. There's just like so much stuff in the 19th century that happens that is weirdly relevant to what we're talking about here, because I haven't talked about a Leo in a while, and I know, I get it. In Italy, this is the time period as well where Italy forms as a nation. Obviously, you look at a map of Europe today, Italy's, a big old boot with Sicily down at the bottom there, and also the island of Sardinia, which is the one in green on the map there. Italy now is one nation, and in our head, maybe, and again, this might be sort of like a North American difference versus someone who grew up in Europe, it's like, well, why wouldn't they be? They all speak Italian. They're all over there doing Italy things. Like, they should be one country. At the time, again, this was new. This was a novel idea brought about by some of these revolts and reforms and technological and economic and social advances that were made in this time period. And so Italy is unified under a king named Victor Emmanuel II. Of the nation of Sardinia Piedmont, which is the green territory on the left-hand side of the map there, if you can see that. That was the territory that he originally was king of, and then through military conquest, really good diplomacy, along with some other like nationalistic democratic efforts, like not democratic, but ginning up support among the local population in various places. is able to functionally seize control of all of Italy, including the Papal States. Pope Pius IX, who is the Pope of this time period, eventually loses even the city of Rome to the Italian kingdom. Rome is made the Italian capital, as it is today, and Pius IX refers to himself as the prisoner in the Vatican, refusing to leave the Vatican for fear of in some way justifying or cooperating with this movement that had functionally stripped him, and not just him, but the papacy, of any real temporal power. He's basically the king of a building now, rather than the king of, again, a good chunk of northern Italy. And Pius saw leaving the Vatican as a way of not justifying, but sort of rubber stamping that situation. And so he stays locked up in the Vatican, as do popes from this period, which is we're looking at like 1870s or so, from 1870s all the way up to the 1930s, when Pope Pius XII and Benito Mussolini sign an agreement that sort of fundamentally deals with the land dispute claims between Italy and the papacy. But for about 60 years, the Pope fundamentally does not leave the Vatican at any point for any significant reason. And so the Papal States in this period are gone, which is quite significant in terms of what the papacy does. But in a lot of ways, it creates some benefits for the papacy as well. So I want to mention just a couple last things here. Again, I know everything everywhere all at once. There's a lot going on in the 19th century. Part of this era too, it is very easy to look at this time period and go, to in some sense admire all of the things that went on, the tightening of the world in a way that enabled communication and economic opportunity, and the manner in which people could interact with one another across these different lines and come together around sort of this idea of like a nation, and that we should be part of something together, and the sort of camaraderie that existed in that time period. And I'm not like going to say like all those things are all bad or whatever. However, the era also saw a lot of upheaval in the lives of fundamentally ordinary people. Up in the top left there is an image of I believe it was I can't remember where I pulled this from now, but fundamentally like factory work, where you'd have just these rows of workers, depending on the job, sometimes women, sometimes children, sometimes men, depending on the job, doing things, whether it's like putting markings on like pottery to like art it up a little bit, or doing needlework or sewing work or fabric making or looms or big old industrial, like what we still think of as industrial, like steel beams and that sort of thing, timber work, all these different kinds of things coming together in these horrible conditions. This is the era of sweatshop development. This is the era of this sort of action going on. Up in the top right there, you have this group called the Luddites. These were like skilled like fabric workers, weavers in this thing, in the town of Ludd in Britain, who rose up in order to smash all of the looms in the city because they were being put out of work. These people who had trained for years to like learn this craft well were being outpriced, and their whole livelihood was being ruined by a robot function, a 19th century robot. Then the automation there. You've got down at the bottom there, many of you might recognize that particular image from one of the old Oliver Twist movies, Please Sir, I Want Some More, famous Dickens line. Charles Dickens wrote extensively about the problems of the poor and impoverished in England. Many of his books sort of focus on that as a theme. So remember that when you're reading Christmas Carol or watching Christmas Carol this time of year, that the Cratchits are an example of that, right? That Bob Cratchit is working himself to the bone for a sort of tyrant overlord money counter, so he can afford the piddliest goose at Christmas, right? Like this sort of idea of the poverty that great throngs of people live in started to become noticeable. And this is also the area where you have philosophies like socialism and communism coming to the forefront, in some way promising to address these problems, that if we restructure society in XYZ way, that the interest of those who own stuff and the interest of those who actually like do work for a living are in this current system in conflict with one another. But if we organize society a different way, then that conflict won't exist. You know, that working people will have enough, and that this outcome will come from this policy, and this outcome will come from that policy. So you have all these different things develop over the course of this time period, which brings us to Leo the 13th. I want to give you an idea of Leo's life here. I haven't really done this with a lot of the other popes. Leo the 13th is born in 1810, which means that this year the man would be 215 years old, okay? He lives up to 1903. Leo the 13th, to kind of give you like a time dilation sense here, if you're like a history person, is born to a colonel in Napoleon's army. So his dad is rubbing shoulders with Napoleon, right? Leo is alive at the same time as Napoleon. And Leo dies 4 months shy of the first manned flight by the Wright brothers. So he is between Napoleon and planes, and everything in between there is something he's around for, okay? Admittedly, 93 is a pretty good run, okay, if you do the math on his age there. But he lived through all these things that I've been talking about. That's the reason why I've been talking about them, is because his life and what he sees in coming up through the church and eventually as Pope encompasses all of those things that I've been talking about: the nationalism, the economic development, the economic poverty, the empire building, and the various technologies that support that. All of these different things, Leo inform Leo's understanding of the world and what goes on sort of around him. He's elected in the latter half of the century in 1878 and serves for 25 years as Pope, which is, I think, the fourth longest run of the Pope. St. Peter takes the cake at number 1. I think he's traditionally understood to have been Pope for around like 40 years or something like that, though, again, we don't have like hard dates on that. Pius IX, the Pope who was the prisoner in the Vatican, is the longest running. Leo the 13th is next. JP2, and then Leo I actually is also in like the top 5. But he is one of the longest serving popes of the era, or in general. And Leo's papacy is very different to that of his former namesake, of the 12th. Because what Leo does is fundamentally offer, I think, like a handshake to the world, which is not to say that he's going to like cut back on church teaching just because something might be, you know, more or less politically favorable or viable or that sort of thing. That's not his style. That's not what he's doing. He's not trying to like cafeteria Catholic it up. But what he is doing is recognizing that the church, up to his time, you know, sort of from Leo the 11th to him, has not done a good job of bringing the gospel into conversation with the various changes of the world, only really into conflict with it. And so Leo the 13th sets about trying to allow the gospel to speak to this world rather than to, you know, again, like putting it into systemic conflict with these new ideas and different things. He also does a great deal of work arguing for diplomacy and the rights of Catholics, particularly in Germany, where the policies of a guy named Otto von Bismarck, who fundamentally creates the German nation, as in like the nation of Germany, and also in the United States, where there was a lot of anti-Catholic prejudice against Catholics. A lot of Catholics coming into the U.S. in this time period from places like Ireland, you know, potato famine going on, places like Italy, places like South Germany, other particular Catholic parts of the world coming into the U.S. and were receiving a lot of resistance. I remember when I was in school, we learned about these signs that people would put out, which just said Nina, N-I-N-A, which meant no Irish need apply, and that sort of thing going on. I know like Canada, and depending on where you were, also had similar movements sort of throughout it of pushing back against these papists and Catholics and that sort of thing. But Leo the 13th does his best through various diplomatic efforts to encourage those governments to recognize the rights of Catholics to just kind of exist and be functional members of society, which I think is a good thing as a Catholic who wants to be a functional member of society. I appreciate that. And so he does a great deal of things in this way. I want to show you, actually, I'm going to jump back here a second. I'm going to put something up here on the screen. This is just a thing I found that was cool, and I couldn't not show it to you. There's no reason for me to do this like educationally other than it's neat. There's a video up here taken at the Vatican in the latter in 1903 or 1803. Sorry, 1893. Come on, brain. 1893, where Leo the 13th is just filmed basically walking and sitting on a bench with some members of some other prelates sort of around him, making potentially, I don't know, I'm fully willing to be wrong on this, Leo the 13th, the oldest person to ever be committed to film. And I'm going to show you this film now. It is silent because it's 1893, guys. There's no audio, but there is an audio add-in that has been put into this, which is also Leo the 13th. It starts about like 20 or 30 seconds into the clip of Leo the 13th praying the Hail Mary in Latin, which also means he might be the oldest person that we have the voice of as well. Which it's just too cool to not show you, even though I have nothing to really point to about this other than it's neat. So I'm going to show you the neat thing. So here we go. That's Leo in the white with the big old hat there.
Santa Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostre. Amen.
Again, quality isn't like, this wouldn't air today, right? Like this wouldn't do super well today, but again, the idea that we have the voice and the moving image of someone born to one of Napoleon's colonels is mind-blowing to me. But again, just shows the innovation of the age in which Leo lives. The idea that something that would have been unthinkable at his birth, that you just heard the voice of someone who would be 215 years old this year, I don't know what to do with that apart from just show it to people. So I did. But Leo also does a great deal on the doctrinal side in a number of different ways, one of which he writes a number of encyclicals, which increasingly in his time and afterwards become a tool of the papacy in order to guide, guard, and govern across the world. Writing these letters, fundamentally, is what encyclical means, is fundamentally a letter from the Pope to very often they're addressed to the bishops and all the faithful sort of thing. So you regularly do get mail from the Pope, and you should probably read it from time to time. But Leo writes a number of encyclicals on the Rosary, and so much so that in his time, some people call him the Rosary Pope. writing these various things on the efficacy and importance of praying the rosary and of cultivating a devotion to our Blessed Mother, alongside with obviously a deep faith and trust in the work of Jesus Christ as well. Leo also is the author of what you might know as the St. Michael's Prayer. Leo XIII writes this after sort of the tradition or the legend is that Leo, in saying Mass, has this horrific, like literally, I mean this literally, a hellish vision of, demonic hootie-ha going on, and has this vision and is like thrown into such tumult by it that he crafts this prayer and actually has them like appended to the end of Mass, what are known as the Leonine prayers, which for like traditional Mass, like Latin Mass element of praying the Mass, these prayers are appended to the back of that as a prayer for the Pope and the Church as a whole against the enemy. So this particular prayer, the St. Michael prayer, which you might be familiar with. If not, I encourage you to become familiar with it. It's a cracking prayer, but is written by Leo XIII. And Leo also charts a course that the Church is fundamentally still following today in many ways. This document called Aeterni Patris, which means Eternal Father, or the more descriptive English name is On the Restoration of Christian Philosophy, fundamentally centers the work of St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine as the way in which the Church thinks about and does theology. It brings them into sort of like the centerpiece and uses their work as fundamental cornerstones of talking about God and talking about the Church and talking about virtue and all the relationships between those things. So, the last thing that I want to share with you about Leo, and this is the thing that I have been truly waiting, not just an hour and 15 minutes, but 7 weeks to talk to you all about, is this document, which you might be familiar with or you might not be. If you haven't heard of this document before, that's fine, but that also means I know you didn't do your homework because it was in your packet. The whole of it is. I really do encourage you to read this document at some point. It's I say this as a nerd. It's only 20 pages, give or take, but it is one of the most important church documents since its creation. Many successive popes afterwards have written documents that are basically just dates from this, the most recent of which being St. John Paul II, who wrote 100 years on, because this document is written in 1891 too, I think. And 100 years on, John Paul II writes his own encyclical in commentary and conversation with it. Earlier popes, including St. John the 23rd, including, I believe, Pius the 11th, 12th, also write one, which is like 40 years on, and there's 80 years on from the creation of this document. And you know a document's important when you're dating things based on it, okay? This document is called Rerum Novarum, which the English translation is On New Things, or on the New Things, which is fundamentally Leo writing about the new things of the world. What new things? Technology and industry, a new economic system, nationalism, imperialism, how things work in the world at that time. The other English translations of it of the title are On the Conditions and Rights of Workers, and things of that nature. Because one of the things that Leo is in conversation with and saw throughout the course of the 19th century was how the poverty of the masses was, one, just a sin in its own right, that in a world that apparently is producing so much abundance, that people should, through no fault of their own, go without food, clothing, or shelter. The basics of life is, that's not, the world is not working correctly if that's the situation we're in. And also in response to some of these other movements, particularly elements like socialism and communism that had sprung up at the same time, Leo is sort of pushing back on those ideas as solutions to what are fundamental, like the working man's problem of, again, and the problem, of course, I hear being living, right? This isn't like a highfalutin problem. It's having enough food to put on the table to keep you and your family alive and fed, right? That's the problem we're talking about here. So Leo does this, and I really consider this document a new wineskin, because there's nothing in it that isn't already elsewhere earlier in the church, right? Like, you go back to Jesus, and it's like, take care of the poor, y'all. Like, that's a core part of the gospel, is whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me. Like, that's at ground zero, right? This is commentary on that principle, but it's commentary on that principle in light of how the world had rapidly changed in the course of the 19th century. And I would argue is still very much a document that is worth reading and considering in light of today and the current sort of socio-economic political landscape that we live in. But he's not trying to pour old wine, as the adage of Jesus, right? Putting new wine in old wineskins, it'll burst. He's like, here's a new wineskin, right? We're not starting from ground zero, but we're taking the wine and putting it into a new wineskin so that it is accessible and ready for people of this age. And it focuses fundamentally on the obligations between different classes of person, with obviously a special care and concern for, as the document's title would suggest, the rights and conditions of working men and people in sort of like your manual labor, day labor, farm labor sorts of jobs, including men and women, by the way. There's a number of sections on women, some of which, I'm going to be honest, it's a document from the 1800s, hasn't aged super well. But in other parts of it is like, hey, maybe don't give kids jobs that are like dangerous, and don't give jobs to women who can't do them. Don't make her like lug stones around, perhaps. That's not a safe use of the human dignity of a woman in this instance. If her body is not capable, if a person is incapable of doing the job, don't give them the job to do, right? Like, take care of your workers, business owners, is a core refrain throughout the whole of the document. And this document creates the basis for what are considered now the Catholic social teaching principles. Again, there's nothing new in these principles. This isn't like an innovation in the sense that the Pope's just like making up stuff off the top of his head because he's bored on a Saturday. It's again, taking the gospel message and putting it back into conversation with a world that is very different from the world previous, and to be honest, very different from the world of Jesus Christ himself, right? When Jesus is out walking around, he's out here making analogies about like vineyards, farms, and shepherds, and the only time I see any of those things is when I go to the valley to go to look at vineyards. And it's not quite the same experience, Jesus. So, my experience of what you're talking about is very different. But these principles are still in line with us today. I'm just going to throw them at you real quick here. There's 7 of them. Some of these might sound particularly familiar to you. The first and foremost principle is the life and dignity of the human person, that the human person should be treated as something created, an entity created in the image and likeness of God from conception to natural death. That's sort of core principle of Catholic understanding of the human person. The call to family and the call to community participation, that we are social creatures and should be able to take care of our close relationships and foster extended relationships within friends and people in a particular community, however big that community may or may be. The right that we have certain rights and responsibilities in sort of our political life as civic members of society, that there is a preferential option for the poor and vulnerable, that any decision that we make should put the care and concern of the poor front and center. How is this decision going to affect those who have no voice in this conversation? The rights and dignities of work and workers, that work is a good thing. It's a way by which man is able to take care of himself and a woman is able to take care of herself. How we are able to create and participate with God in the act of creating and building the world alongside what God has already sort of given us the tools to do. That is a dignified thing to do. There is no shame in working for your living, which very different connotation then versus now, but that is part of it. Solidarity, basically, we're all in this together. We got to take care of each other. What happens to one of us will surely affect others. You must understand this kind of thing. And a care for God's creation, that the environment and creation itself is a gift of God, and it would be wrong to abuse or neglect or destroy it wantonly. And so these these 7 principles are throughout many Catholic social teaching documents throughout. I think of particularly like in Pope Francis's tenure, Laudato Si, on care for our common home, which is on the environment, very much part of this tradition. Also Fratelli Tutti, that we are all brothers, this sort of community element of the social teaching. John Paul II writes on 100 years on the economic rights, kind of how the situation has changed and developed in the intervening 100 years since the time of this. We're now up to, I think, like 125-ish, give or take. So maybe Leo the 14th's first encyclical is going to be 130 years later. I don't know. I'm calling that one now. If I'm right, you all owe me a Coke. That all these principles are important, but one of the things that Leo front and centers in the course of this document is the role and responsibility of Christian institutions to support those in the community who struggle to support themselves. And so part and parcel with that, I've asked George LeBlanc to come here tonight. George LeBlanc is a member of our parish's chapter of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, who does a lot of work in that regard and area. And so I've asked George if you want to come up to share a little bit about the work that St. Vincent de Paul does, both in this time of year and just sort of generally, to give you a sense of how fundamentally like Rerum Novarum is impacting our world here in our little corner of Lower Sackville. So George, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks for the invitation to come and speak. Welcome. So good evening, everyone. My name is George LeBlanc. I'm happy to be with you this evening to speak a little bit about St. Vincent de Paul Society, and in particular our conference here in Lower Sackville. Who we are and what we do in our community. A little bit about me to start. I, along with my wife Mary Frances, have been members of St. John Vianney, now Holy Trinity, since late 1982. If you do the mental math exercise, that's 43 years. I've been involved with a number of ministries over those years, primarily music ministry, but also Eucharistic ministry, participated in 6 Alpha courses, and various other committees and special events. Anyway, enough about me. Let's talk about St. Vincent de Paul Society. 5 years ago, I was pitched the notion of joining the St. Vincent de Paul Society by Ralph McDonald. Some of you may remember Ralph, Gene Rent's brother, making an association there. I wasn't an easy sell, but he's a very persistent guy. So I did gladly join a group of about 15 of us, I guess, nowadays, dedicated volunteers. I took over the reins as conference president a year ago, October. Happy to do so, and I'm extremely proud of the folks that make up our group, St. Vincent de Paul. Brief history. Back in the 1600s, a French priest working tending to his parishioners in rural France, in a village, saw a lot of people who were suffering, unable to meet their needs for nutrition and to heat themselves in their homes. He decided, I got to start collecting stuff and giving it to these people. And therein planted the seed that one day would become the St. Vincent de Paul Society. Fast forward to the 19th century, 1833, Paris, France. You have a young student, 20 years old or thereabouts. He's a student at the Sorbonne. Him and his buddies are seeing the plight daily. They're walking to school and they're walking home. They're seeing the plight of people in France. At that time, a lot of the people had migrated from rural areas into the city because they were impoverished and they thought they could do better in Paris. Nah, wasn't the case. They suffered a great deal. he was inspired by the story of Father Vincent de Paul to create a charitable group to see what they could do for the seemingly countless numbers of people desperately poor they encountered on the streets of Paris every day. So they had a little meeting. At the end of their first meeting, they decided, well, let's put these words into action. So they gathered up firewood, that's all they had to give, and they brought it to a woman who was unable to heat her home. And that was the first act. And that event marked what would become a society that has spread to over 150 countries, and it still holds true to the original values and intents of its founders to perform simple acts of kindness for the poor in their respective communities. Women were involved too at a very early stage. Their first female collaborator was Sister Rosalie Rondeau, and Frederick was smart enough to get women involved, and she provided the guidance on how they should best direct their efforts to help the poor and the underprivileged. Our patron saint, by the way, became St. Vincent de Paul, which makes sense. And he was so named by Pope Leo XIII. I was going to throw in a factoid at this point about the prayer to St. Michael, but should have known that Alex would have had that covered. So the Canadian story starts back as early as 1846 in Quebec. There was a student who was attending university in Paris, came back home, and decided that he would form a first council, I guess you could call it, in Quebec City. But nationally, we formed in 1853, and the Halifax Council stood up that same year. And today, there's 18 parish groups spread throughout the province that fall under the Halifax Particular Council. Our group here in Sackville was established around 2000, so I guess you could call us millennium babies. We started out with just a few good-hearted folks, not a lot of money. I know Marilyn, I think maybe a couple of $1,000 or something like that to start out with. It wasn't much, but those folks had the full faith in their abilities to do good things for the poor. So our area covers Sackville, Beaverbank, and Mount Uniacke communities, by the way. As I mentioned earlier, the core of what we do is centered on simple acts to help the less fortunate in our community. Our mission in Canada is to live the gospel message by serving Christ in the poor with love, respect, justice, and joy. In keeping with Pope Leo's devotion to social justice, we Vincentians, as we're called, strongly believe that all persons are deserving of being treated with dignity and respect and have a right to a decent standard of life. Part of that has to be having the basic necessities that you need to achieve this social safety standard that we all must have. What sort of things do we do? Here's a few examples. We deliver groceries to many people in need who may have financial limitations, mobility issues, or other limitations that hamper or even prevent them from accessing their food needs. We help with the utility bills, be it for home heating, electricity bills, water, phone, medication, access to public transportation. We work in conjunction with Beacon House to provide not only food deliveries, but clothing as well. We source good used furniture when we receive requests for such items. For 2024, we answered over 300 requests for the various types of assistance requested and delivered in excess of $65,000 worth of goods and services. We raise funds through the generosity of parishioners at St. John Vianney, through our regular Poor Box collection, which you guys are well familiar with at the entry, and primarily through our Angel Tree campaign. You see that's all set up and good to go, and I know the generosity of our parishioners. We always do well with that. We also receive regular contributions from various parishes around the Sackville area, so it's not just here. We are community supported with the wider community of Sackville. People are very kind here. So we don't just drop off groceries or pay whatever bill and then disappear for a month and come back A central part of our community action is communicating directly with those we serve as our clients, and that is done through home visits. We visit new clients as teams of two and get to know them as people, not just to assess their situation, although that's an important factor in how we direct our efforts. We seek to establish a relationship with those we serve to show them that we do respect them as people and want them to feel comfortable in reaching out for a handout. Part of the social justice Pope Leo was dedicated to and that our society stands for to this day. Our group meets once a month, mostly on Zoom since COVID, but we see ourselves going back the other way and being more in person. We meet to discuss our progress, efforts to raise funds, individual cases we might have to get group input about, recruiting efforts, and any info sharing from the Halifax and the National Councils. We pray together, led by our spiritual advisor, who is Father Tim, and he's a staunch supporter of who we are and what we do. We're very blessed to have his support. New members are always welcome, whether as full members or as casual members. Full members do the reach out and the home visits to people, whereas casual members will assist with grocery deliveries. There's a screening process for new members as we're dealing with a vulnerable segment of the population, so we have to be very cognizant of that. That involves a police screening process, which is not a difficult or stressful part, as well as an interview with two of our full members, mostly to get to know the new candidates who want to join us and get a sense of whether they will be a good fit, if you will. We work on an on-call rotation of 1 week per month, which means answering requests via our message line, acting on those requests by making contact directly, then carrying out the action or redirecting it to the responsible person. Things like power bills, rent assistance, etc. Food deliveries generally take up to 2 hours each morning, 4 days a week, and we check the message line every day of the week. So consider this my pitch, folks. Not going to get me to stand up to give a speech without trying to recruit. That's my job. This is a direct, impactful work that makes a real difference to the people that we serve. And dare I say, makes a significant impact to the people who bring the service to our clients. So for those of us who choose to become Vincentians, it's a truly rewarding experience to bring some small measure of social justice to the people who need it so badly. Thank you.
Example of what Leo kind of had in mind with this document, and George and Vincenzo's are very much a way in which we can participate in that here. You heard him. If you want to help out, if you want to respond to what Leo is asking you to do, there's the man. I'm sorry if I sick a couple dozen people on you tonight, but I hope I do, to be honest. And to get involved with all the good work that they do here in this community. So yeah, this document, again, I can't emphasize enough how important it is, and I really do recommend taking a crack at it and trying to understand it. It is written in sort of churchese a little bit, and there's socio-political stuff in there that you probably want to have some context for, but this document is an incredibly important part of the modern church. And how the modern church interacts with the world. As I said, characterized Leo at the start of his introduction here, it's offering a handshake to the world in an effort to cooperate with it on those things that it needs help with, and those things that, as Leo says in the document, this isn't going to work without the church. Like any attempt to fix these things without the support of the church is going to kind of fall on its face. So I wanted to say one brief thing about Leo XIV, right? I kind of intended originally to end it with Leo XIII, but then I looked at the program again. It's like, I did include 14 on there, so I should probably say something. But this is one of the things that's really difficult to do because Leo XIV, is new. There's a great line by a playwright named Alan Bennett, who wrote a play called The History Boys. And in the play, one of the characters says, "There is no territory so distant as the recent past." There's nothing that's more difficult to comment on than the stuff that just happened. And so I don't necessarily want to say a whole lot about our current Holy Father, Leo XIV, except to say this, that as many of you might have heard in the various articles and get to know yous and all that sort of stuff from when he was elected back before the summertime, Leo XIV chose his name for his predecessor. He chose his name because of the work that Leo XIII did in advocating for everyday people, for the fraternity among people who feel that they are from fundamentally different worlds, whether that's socioeconomically, whether that's politically, whether that's religiously, but also because of the increasing troubles in our day and time of automation of different things, of these different problems that are in our current world since the 1800s, sort of perennial problems for people who struggle to make ends meet and struggle to find work that is not only well-paying enough to support themselves and their family to have a living wage on, but also treats them with dignity and as a human person, not just as a cog in the machine that can be replaced when it tires out. Leo XIV, so the reason he chose his papal name was in light of the work done by his immediate Leonine predecessor, Leo XIII, and all of the work that he did in that respect. And also the way in which I would argue, as Leo the First sort of set the stage for the papacy kind of writ large, Leo XIII sets the stage for the papacy of our time period. His actions as pope fundamentally set the course that our current popes, continue to run through and run along, whether they are more pastoral like Pope Francis, more doctrinal like Pope Benedict, or more sort of a little bit of everything like St. John Paul II, or I'm going to be honest, whatever he gets up to. It's been 6 months. I don't know. I haven't had time to do that. A good job outlasting 11. So I don't necessarily want to say a whole lot on him because we're still learning, right? I've sort of approached this series through the tools of history, and he ain't history yet. He's today. So I want to close off with a couple of things here. Your takeaways today, I hope, is that the modern Leos, which is to say 12, 13, and 14, worked to varying degrees of success to put the gospel into conversation with the times as they changed. Just picture the Pope with Bob Dylan, okay? As they sort of have this conversation of how does the gospel still apply in a different world than it was, proclaimed to initially, right? And then also the papacy's authority in this time shifts away from being able to exert temporal authority of working to admonish kings and deliver excommunications and work through these various other diplomatic apparatuses and whatnot. I mean, the Pope doesn't even, technically does. He's the sovereign of the Vatican City state, but again, I don't really see the Vatican as a nation really doing a whole lot. There's not a lot that happens there apart from tourism and mass. But the authority of the Pope is arguably, in some senses, stronger than it ever has been in this era that connects us to him. Like, you can see a picture of what this guy looks like. I would say the vast majority of Catholics, before Leo XIII, had no idea what the Pope looked like in a lot of senses, that the relationship between the faithful and the papacy has developed a great deal since then, and the papacy wields a spiritual authority, I would say, that is much stronger today than it has been throughout most, if not all, of its history. Its capacity to sort of guide, guard, and govern the faithful is one of its greatest strengths. and one which I would argue the more modern popes have wielded with not without missteps, but with due deference to the role that they have been called into by the Church and the Holy Spirit. So the Leo the 13th sort of sets this stage for the modern popes that they continue to kind of follow in that mold afterwards. I am cognizant of time. We are already 15 minutes over, and I don't want to keep going too long. So what I'm going to say is this. I'm going to give you a couple last little takeaways here, and then if anyone has any sort of questions and answers, feel free to stick around. I'm happy to stay and chat if that is of interest to anybody on any of these particular topics or on the course as a whole. But I wanted to kind of leave you with a couple of things here as the course itself wraps up. One, boy, the Leos aren't boring. There's a lot that happens with these guys. Again, as I said at the start of this thing, this whole all started because I went down a Wikipedia rabbit hole after they elected Leo the 14th, and it's been interesting learning about all this. And I hope you all feel the same, that it's been interesting and edifying learning about all of these different guys throughout the course of our time together. That the papacy sort of has two sides as well, I think is a fair thing that we can say. That there is a reactive element to the papacy, of the Pope responding to the things of the world or responding to various currents in the church, right? Leo the First is sort of drawn into this theological conflict in the eastern half of the church. Leo the Third crowns Charlemagne as emperor in response to the power vacuum around him. Leo X, it writes against Martin Luther because Martin Luther wrote something first, right? It's not the Pope out here trying to start new stuff. It's trying to deal with everything kind of coming at it. The papacy, rather, trying to deal with everything coming at it. But on the other hand, there is this proactive element of the papacy, of the Pope doing things for the good of not just the church in his day, but the good of the church in the future, right? I think our popes today are really good descriptors of that, Leo the 13th in particular. But also you have, the reforms that Leo the 9th did, trying to clean up some of the clerical mess of the church, along with Leo the 8th, who had to pick up after the pieces of the Dark Age and a papacy that was kind of in shambles, and a church that was also not doing super hot at the time either. You have all these different popes that are looking to use their role of guiding, guarding, and governing in a way that creates blessing for those down the line, people that they will never meet in person, but hopefully one day will meet in heaven. Which brings me to our last point, our role in the papacy. Obviously, I don't foresee anyone here necessarily electing the next pope. I don't think that's going to be a big part of our lives, maybe. I don't know if the world changes drastically in the next little while here. But we do have a role in this because one of the things the Catechism teaches about the Pope is that the Pope is a sign to the whole church and to the whole world of the unity of the church. This is one of the things that I want to kind of leave you with in a particular way. Being in communion with Rome, being in communion with the Bishop of Rome, the apostle, the successor of the Prince of the Apostles, the Supreme Pontiff of the Universal Church, puts you in communion with every other Catholic on God's green earth, and also those who aren't on God's green earth anymore. That through our communion with Rome, through our communion with the Pope, we have a sign on this side of eternity of our connection as Catholic Christians to those across the world. I think we're up to 1.4 billion Catholics, nominally or otherwise, across the world, that we are in a family with by virtue of a connection with this figure. That this is a source of unity, and that this source of unity is meant to be a sign on this side of eternity of the communion that we have, not with some random guy named Robert from Chicago, but with the living God who rose from the dead. That is sort of what that communion with Rome is meant to symbolize, is not just a communion with a guy in a palace with a fancy hat and a cool job title. It's meant to symbolize and to give us a way to interact with the unity that we share as sons and daughters of God, as brothers and sisters of Jesus Christ. Like, that is our role in the papacy, that by being in connection, in communion with Rome, in communion with the Holy Father, we are in communion with him, with all of our Catholics living currently, all Catholics who have come before us, and in a sign and symbol sort of way, in communion with Jesus Christ himself. I can't think of anything cooler than that. And that's one of the things that I've learned over the course of this, is just, again, what a gift the papacy is to the church and to the world. That this has been just a truly amazing thing. And so as we come together at the end of our evening here, I encourage you, as we pray one last time as this particular community for Pope Leo, to, think about it. Basically is kind of where I'm going with this, that Leo, that as we pray for our Holy Father, that we are in communion with him and with all other Christians and Catholics throughout the world, including God himself, and I can't think of anything better than that. So I invite us, as I said, I'll stick around a bit if you want to have any Q&A afterwards. I'm happy to do so, but we'll pray one last time as this community for our current Holy Father. And thank you all once again very much for being part of this journey over the last several weeks. So I'll read the vocal parts and you'll read the refrains, and we'll all pray one last time. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Let us pray for Leo, our Pope. May the May your hand be upon your holy servant. Let us pray. O God, the pastor and ruler of all the faithful, look down in your mercy upon your servant Leo, whom you have appointed to preside over your church. Grant, we beseech you, that by both word and example he may edify all those under his charge, so that with the flock entrusted to him, we may arrive at length unto life everlasting. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you all very much, and I'll see you in church, I guess.